September 15, 1940. London is burning. Wave after wave of German bombers blacken the sky over Britain. The Luftwaffe is unstoppable. Or so Hitler believes. But 20,000 feet above the English Channel, something impossible is happening. British Spitfires are waiting. Not scrambling, not searching, waiting, in exactly the right place, at exactly the right time. The German pilots are baffled. How do the British always know they're coming? The answer lies in a secret so valuable that Churchill himself said he would rather lose an entire city than reveal it. A technology so revolutionary that it would change warfare forever, and a gamble so dangerous that if it failed, Britain would fall within weeks. This is the story of how a handful of scientists, a chain of strange towers along the British coast, and one of the most audacious intelligence operations in history turned the tide of world. War II before America even entered the war, and it all started with a question that most experts said was impossible to answer. Can you see the invisible? To understand how desperate Britain's situation was in 1940, you need to understand what happened in the spring of that year. In just 6 weeks, Hitler's forces had accomplished what Germany failed to do in 4 years during World War I. France had fallen. The British Army had barely escaped from Dunkirk, leaving behind nearly all of its heavy equipment. The Soviet Union had a non-aggression pact with Germany. America was firmly isolationist. Britain stood alone, and Hitler had a plan to finish them off. Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. But there was a problem. The British Royal Navy was the most powerful in the world. Any invasion fleet crossing the English Channel would be torn to pieces. So Hitler needed to neutralize Britain's naval advantage. His solution? Hermann Göring's Luftwaffe. The plan was simple and brutal. First, destroy the Royal Air Force. Then, bomb Britain into submission. Finally, invade across the Channel with the Royal Navy, either destroyed or too terrified to intervene. On paper, it should have worked. The Luftwaffe had 2,800 aircraft. The RAF had barely 700 fighters. German pilots were battle-hardened from campaigns in Poland, France, and the Low Countries. Many British pilots were fresh out of training, some with less than 10 hours in a Spitfire. The mathematics were simple. Even if the RAF fought brilliantly, they would be overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Every day, they would lose more planes and more pilots than they could replace. Eventually, there would be nothing left between Hitler and London. The Germans knew this. The British knew this. And Churchill knew he needed something more than courage and Spitfires. He needed a miracle. Or, as it turned out, physics. But here's where the story gets interesting. Because the miracle Churchill needed was actually already being built. Not by some mad scientist in a secret laboratory, but by a team of engineers working on a technology that most of the British military establishment thought was either impossible or useless. They called it RDF, Radio Direction Finding. Usat term, know it by its American name, radar. Let's go back to 1935, 5 years before London was burning. The British Air Ministry had a problem. Air defense was essentially impossible. Bombers flew too high and too fast for ground-based observers to give sufficient warning. By the time you saw enemy aircraft, it was too late to scramble fighters. Some people proposed absurd solutions. Build enormous concrete walls around cities. Develop death rays to shoot down planes. Create acoustic mirrors to detect aircraft by sound. That last one was actually built. It didn't work. Then someone at the Air Ministry had a different idea. They asked a physicist named Robert Watson Watt a simple question. Can we build a radio death ray to destroy enemy aircraft? Watson Watt did the math. His answer was no. The amount of radio energy needed to damage an aircraft was impossibly large. But then Watson Watt asked a different question. What if we don't try to destroy them? What if we just try to detect them? The principle was elegant. Radio waves bounce off metal objects. If you send out a radio pulse and listen for the echo, you can detect metal objects, even objects you can't see, even objects beyond the horizon. Watson Watt's team ran tests. They positioned a BBC radio transmitter on one side of an airfield and a receiver on the other. Then they flew a bomber through the beam. The receiver detected the echo. They could see an aircraft using radio waves. It worked, but there was a massive gap between a laboratory demonstration and a functioning air defense system. First problem, range. Those early tests detected aircraft at maybe 5 miles. That gave you about 2 minutes of warning. Useless. Second problem, precision. Knowing that an aircraft is somewhere out there is different from knowing exactly where it is, how high it's flying, how fast it's going, and what direction it's heading. Third problem, speed. You needed to detect aircraft, determine their position, relay that information to fighter command, scramble fighters, and guide those fighters to intercept, all in the space of minutes. Fourth problem, scale. One radar station could cover maybe 50 miles of coastline. Britain's coastline stretched for hundreds of miles, and radar at that time required enormous towers and huge amounts of power. Fifth problem, no one had ever done anything like this before. Most military leaders looked at these problems and said radar was a nice scientific curiosity, but not a practical weapon. They wanted to invest in more fighters and more anti-aircraft guns, known quantities, but a small group of advocates, including Watson Watt and a RAF officer named Hugh Dowding, saw something different. They saw a revolution in warfare. Dowding understood something crucial. The side that sees the enemy first wins, always. In every battle throughout history, intelligence and information win wars. Radar didn't just give you a few extra minutes of warning. It fundamentally changed the battle. Instead of standing patrols that exhausted pilots and wasted fuel searching empty sky, fighters could stay on the ground until needed. Instead of scattering forces to protect everywhere, you could concentrate forces exactly where the attack was happening. Instead of guessing enemy strength and reacting blindly, you could see the entire battlefield. Radar transformed air defense from impossible to feasible, but only if they could build it in time. Between 1935 and 1939, while Hitler was rearming Germany and preparing for war, Britain was racing to build something that had never existed, an integrated air defense network. They called it the Chain Home System. Imagine a chain of radio towers stretching down the entire eastern coast of Britain. Each tower was over 350 feet tall, taller than Big Ben. These towers would continuously broadcast radio pulses. Receiver towers would listen for echoes. When an aircraft crossed the North Sea or the English Channel, the radar would detect it while it was still dozens of miles away. The radar operators would plot the aircraft's position. That information would be transmitted to Fighter Command Headquarters, where it would be plotted on a massive map table. Controllers would then direct fighter squadrons to intercept. The entire system, detection, communication, command, and control, had to work together seamlessly. By September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and Britain declared war, Chain Home had 21 stations operational. It was the world's first integrated air defense network, but it was also completely untested in combat. When the Battle of Britain began in July 1940, Britain was about to gamble everything on a technology that many still doubted. And Germany was about to learn that technological surprise can matter more than numerical superiority. But there was a twist that neither side fully understood yet. Radar wasn't just a technology. It was also a secret that had to be protected. And the lengths Britain went to protect that secret would involve deception, sacrifice, and decisions that haunt historians to this day. July 10, 1940. The Battle of Britain begins. German intelligence had identified RAF fighter bases, aircraft factories, and radar stations as primary targets. Göring's plan was systematic. Destroy the RAF on the ground and in the air. Within weeks, Britain would be defenseless. The first German raids were probing attacks. testing British defenses, learning response times. And immediately, German pilots noticed something strange. No matter when they attacked, no matter what route they took, British fighters were waiting for them. Not always in overwhelming numbers, but always there, always positioned perfectly for an attack. At first, the Germans assumed they had traitors, or that their communications were compromised. But the phenomenon was too consistent, too precise. Some German pilots started reporting mysterious towers along the British coast. Tall steel structures that seemed to serve no obvious purpose. Intelligence officers investigated. They concluded these were radio towers, possibly experimental communication equipment. They didn't understand their real purpose. Meanwhile, at RAF Fighter Command Headquarters, the radar network was performing beyond expectations. Here's how it worked in practice. A Luftwaffe formation takes off from France. Within minutes, chain home stations detect the aircraft 70 miles away. The radar operators determine bearing, range, and approximate altitude. This information is transmitted to Fighter Command. At Fighter Command Headquarters, young women in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force use rakes to push markers across a giant map table, showing the position of enemy aircraft. Controllers stand on a balcony above, watching the developing situation. A controller orders a fighter squadron to scramble. 12 Hurricanes climb to 20,000 feet, vector 120 degrees. The fighters take off. Ground controllers guide them toward the incoming raid using continuous radar updates. Meanwhile, the German formation is being tracked continuously. If it changes course, Fighter Command sees it immediately and adjusts the intercept. The RAF fighters arrive at altitude with the sun behind them. Position advantage and surprise. They strike. The Germans never saw them coming. This happened again, and again, and again. For the first time in history, defenders had complete battlefield awareness. The RAF wasn't fighting blind. They were fighting with their eyes wide open while the Germans were fumbling in the dark. The difference was profound. In traditional air combat, defenders needed standing patrols to protect targets. This meant fighters spent hours flying search patterns, exhausting pilots and burning fuel. When an attack came, your fighters might be in the wrong place or landing to refuel. With radar, fighters stayed on the ground until needed. Pilots remained fresh. Fuel was conserved. And because you could see exactly where the attack was coming, you could concentrate your forces at the critical point. The Germans had more aircraft, but the British were using their aircraft 3 or 4 times more efficiently. There's a famous quote from Air Chief Marshal Dowding, the commander of Fighter Command. "Without radar, we would have lost the Battle of Britain." But here's the remarkable part. The Germans still didn't fully understand what they were facing. In August 1940, the Luftwaffe changed tactics. Instead of scattered raids, they launched massive attacks. Hundreds of bombers escorted by hundreds of fighters. The goal was to overwhelm British defenses through sheer weight of numbers, and they targeted the radar stations. On August 12th, German bombers attacked chain home stations at Ventnor, Dover, Rye, and Pevensey. The Ventnor station was knocked offline. Bombs damaged several towers. For the first time, Britain's electronic eyes were partially blinded. This was Germany's best chance. If they had concentrated on destroying the radar network, the Battle of Britain might have ended differently. But something strange happened. After a few days of attacks on radar stations, the Germans stopped. They shifted focus to RAF airfields instead. Why? German intelligence made a fatal error. They concluded that the radar stations weren't that important. When they bombed Ventnor, British operators implemented deception measures. They continued transmitting fake signals to make the Germans think the station was still operational. Damaged stations were repaired with remarkable speed. And the Germans didn't understand that destroying a few stations wasn't enough. You needed to knock out the entire network. The Luftwaffe also didn't realize how much of British success depended on radar. Their intelligence officers saw the chain home towers but misunderstood their significance. They thought radar was a minor tactical advantage, not the foundation of Britain's entire defense strategy. So Germany shifted to attacking airfields. This was dangerous for Britain. RAF bases were taking tremendous punishment, but it left the radar network intact. Then, in early September, something happened that changed the entire course of the battle. On September 7th, Hitler ordered the Luftwaffe to shift focus from military targets to London itself. The Blitz had begun. This was partly retaliation for RAF bombing raids on Berlin, but it was also strategic. Hitler believed that by bombing London, he could force the RAF into a decisive battle, where German numerical superiority would prevail. Instead, it saved the RAF. By targeting London, the Germans stopped attacking airfields and radar stations. The RAF got desperately needed time to repair damage and rest exhausted pilots. And the radar network, still intact, continued feeding perfect information to fighter command. September 15, 1940, became the climactic day. The Germans launched 2 massive raids on London, each with over 200 aircraft. The RAF, guided by radar, intercepted both raids with devastating effectiveness. The Germans lost approximately 60 aircraft that day. The RAF lost 26, but more importantly, the Germans realized they couldn't win. They weren't achieving air superiority. Their losses were unsustainable, and they couldn't understand why their numerical advantage wasn't working. Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion, then cancelled it. Britain would not fall, and radar was the invisible shield that saved them. But there's a darker layer to this story. A secret within the secret. Britain didn't just have radar. They had something potentially even more valuable. Ultra-intelligence. The ability to read encrypted German communications through the breaking of the Enigma code at Bletchley Park. Ultra provided confirmation of German plans, targets, and tactics. Combined with radar's real-time tracking, Britain had unprecedented intelligence superiority. But this created an agonizing dilemma. If Britain used ultra-intelligence too obviously, Germany would realize their codes were compromised. They would change their encryption systems. Ultra would go dark. The intelligence advantage would disappear. Churchill and British intelligence faced horrible decisions. Sometimes they received ultra-intelligence about German raids, but couldn't act on it without revealing their source. They needed a plausible explanation for how they knew what they knew. Radar became that explanation. When the RAF achieved seemingly impossible intercepts, the official story was always radar. Our advanced detection systems saw them coming. This was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The cruel calculus of wartime intelligence meant that sometimes British commanders let attacks succeed that they might have stopped, not because they couldn't stop them, but because stopping them would raise questions about intelligence sources. There's a controversial example that historians still debate. Coventry. On November 14, 1940, German bombers devastated Coventry in a raid that killed over 550 people and destroyed much of the medieval city center. Some historians claim Churchill knew about the raid through ultra-intelligence, but didn't provide adequate defense to protect the ultra-secret. The truth is more complex. British intelligence did have warnings, but the specifics of timing and target were unclear. They also did scramble fighters and anti-aircraft defenses, though not enough. And the decision-making wasn't simply sacrifice Coventry to protect Ultra, but the broader point stands. Britain was making ruthless decisions about how to use intelligence without revealing sources. Radar provided cover for Ultra. When Germany asked, "How do the British always know where we are?" the answer was the chain home towers. Visible, obvious, understandable. Germany eventually developed their own radar technology, but they were years behind. And crucially, they never developed an integrated air defense network like chain home. German radar was fragmented, locally controlled, and never achieved the systematic coverage that Britain had. Part of this was technological lag, but part was also strategic blindness. German military doctrine emphasized offensive operations, blitzkrieg, lightning war. They invested heavily in bombers and fighters designed for attack. Air defense was an afterthought. Britain, as an island nation that had survived by defending its shores for centuries, understood defense differently. Radar fit naturally into British strategic thinking. But the true scope of the intelligence war went beyond even radar and ultra. Britain ran elaborate deception operations to protect radar's effectiveness. When radar operators tracked incoming raids, intelligence officers constructed plausible alternative explanations for intercepts. A fishing boat spotted them. A coast watcher telephoned. Anything to avoid highlighting radar's role. They also fed Germany false information about radar's capabilities through double agents, making it seem less effective than it was, making it seem like Britain had radar, but it wasn't decisive. The Germans bought it, even after the war, when German officers were debriefed. Many still didn't fully understand how comprehensively British radar had dominated the Battle of Britain. There's a remarkable memo from Hermann Göring after the war. He wrote, "British fighter defense was superior to ours in organization and leadership, but not in technology or numbers." He still didn't get it. The technology was the foundation. Everything else, the organization, the leadership, the tactics, was built on the information advantage that radar provided. But here's perhaps the most important legacy of the Battle of Britain radar gamble. It proved that technological innovation could trump numerical superiority. Germany had more planes, more pilots, more industrial capacity. All the traditional metrics of military power favored Germany. But Britain had something new: information dominance through technology. This lesson would echo through the rest of World War II and beyond. At Midway, American code-breaking gave the U.S. Navy the intelligence advantage that defeated a superior Japanese fleet. In the Cold War, radar and early warning systems became the foundation of nuclear deterrence. In modern warfare, battlefield awareness through satellites, drones, and sensors is often more valuable than sheer firepower. The Allied radar gamble in 1940 was the first proof of a new rule. In modern warfare, the side that sees the battlefield wins. The Battle of Britain ended in October 1940. Britain had survived. Hitler's first major defeat, but the radar war was just beginning. As radar technology evolved, so did countermeasures. Germans developed radar detectors to warn bombers when they were being tracked. British scientists developed window, strips of aluminum foil dropped from aircraft that created false radar echoes, confusing defenders. The cat-and-mouse game between detection and deception became a separate conflict within the larger war. By 1942, Britain had developed airborne radar. Night fighters could hunt German bombers in the dark. U-boats could be spotted from aircraft. The Battle of the Atlantic turned when radar closed the mid-Atlantic gap, where U-boats had previously operated with impunity. Americans, entering the war after Pearl Harbor, adopted and improved British radar technology. They developed the cavity magnetron, making radar sets smaller and more powerful. By 1944, radar equipped everything from fighters to battleships to proximity-fused artillery shells. The D-Day invasion succeeded, partly because Allied radar gave complete awareness of German aircraft movements, while elaborate deception operations blinded German radar about the true invasion location. Germany, for its part, developed increasingly sophisticated radar systems, but they were always playing catch-up, always reactive rather than proactive. They never integrated radar into their strategic thinking the way Britain did. Some historians argue that Germany's failure to prioritize radar development was one of their most critical strategic errors of the war. But the most profound legacy isn't just military. Radar technology developed. During World War II became the foundation for enormous industries after the war. Air traffic control, weather forecasting, scientific research. Eventually, the same principles led to sonar, GPS, and countless other technologies. The scientists who built Chain Home went on to revolutionize physics, electronics, and computing. Many of the techniques developed for processing radar signals became the basis for early digital computers. Watson Watt, the physicist who asked, "Can we detect them?" instead of, "Can we destroy them?" became one of the most influential figures in 20th century technology. Though, like many wartime innovators, he died in relative obscurity. His obituary in 1973 was just a few paragraphs. The women who operated the radar stations and plotted aircraft positions at fighter command were forgotten for decades. Only recently have historians started recognizing their critical contribution. They weren't just passively watching screens. They were making real-time interpretations and decisions that directly affected battle outcomes. Hugh Dowding, the RAF commander who championed radar and designed the integrated air defense system, was pushed into retirement shortly after the Battle of Britain. Other commanders got credit for the victory. Dowding's insistence on defensive strategy over offensive operations made him unpopular with more aggressive leaders. Only decades later did. Historians recognize that Dowding's vision of technology-enabled defense saved Britain when nothing else could have. This is a common pattern in innovation. The people who see the future most clearly are often dismissed by contemporaries. Revolutionary ideas face resistance precisely because they're revolutionary. In 1935, when Watson Watt proposed using radio waves to detect aircraft, senior military officers thought it was science fiction. 5 years later, it was the only thing standing between Britain and defeat. The lesson isn't just about radar, it's about the courage to invest in unproven technology when conventional solutions are failing. Churchill understood this. Despite pressure to spend every pound on fighters and bombers, things that everyone understood, he protected funding for radar development. He understood that winning the war might require technologies that didn't exist yet. There's a final twist to this story that brings it full circle. In 1940, Britain was alone. America was neutral. The Soviet Union was allied with Germany. The entire weight of Nazi Germany's military was pointed at British shores. But Britain had one invisible advantage. Radar gave them time. Time to rebuild the RAF. Time to resist invasion. Time for America to decide to enter the war. Time for Hitler to make his fatal mistake of invading the Soviet Union. If Britain had fallen in 1940, which was the expected outcome without radar, World War II would have ended differently. Perhaps with a negotiated peace that left Hitler in control of continental Europe. Perhaps with an invasion of Britain that succeeded. We can't know. What we do know is that a chain of radio towers and the scientists who built them bought Britain the time they needed to survive. The Allied radar gamble wasn't just a tactical advantage. It was the hinge on which history turned. September 15th, 1940. British Spitfires waiting at exactly the right place and exactly the right time. Not because of luck, not because of heroism, though there was plenty of that, because scientists asked the right questions, because engineers built something that had never existed, because Britain gambled on technology when everyone said to trust conventional weapons, and because the side that sees the enemy first wins. Hitler never understood why he lost the Battle of Britain. He had more planes, better trained pilots in the beginning, clear numerical superiority. But he was fighting blind while Britain could see. And in modern warfare, that makes all the difference. The towers of the Chain Home network are mostly gone now, torn down or collapsed decades ago. But their legacy is everywhere. Every time you board an airplane tracked by radar. Every time a weather forecast predicts storms days in advance. Every time GPS guides you to your destination, all of it traces back to a desperate gamble in 1940. a bet that invisible radio waves could defeat the most powerful military machine in the world. It was the right bet, and it saved the world. The Allied radar gamble wasn't just about technology. It was about imagination, the courage to believe that the impossible might be possible. That defeat might be avoided through innovation rather than resignation. In the darkest moment of the 20th century, when civilization itself hung in the balance, a handful of scientists and the leaders who believed in them proved that human ingenuity could overcome overwhelming odds. That's the real lesson of the Battle of Britain. Not that radar won the war, but that asking the right questions and pursuing unconventional solutions can change everything. Robert Watson Watt was once asked if he regretted anything about his role in developing radar. He said yes. He regretted that it was eventually used to guide missiles and weapons he never imagined, but he never regretted asking the question that started it all. What if we just tried to detect them? That simple question saved Britain, changed warfare, and shaped the modern world. Sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't the biggest bomb or the fastest plane. Sometimes it's just the ability to see what's coming